So, Simon Pressley, founder and head of research for Propertyology. Perhaps we could start with you telling us a little bit about what Propertyology actually is.
Oh, I guess an analogy, Terry, well, I guess we're the property equivalent of the stockbroker. To us, Australia, the 8 capital cities and the 400 odd, regional towns is the equivalent of a company on the stock exchange to us. So Propertyology's role is to research the credentials from a property market perspective of each one of those companies on the stock exchange and to make objective assessments as to whether people should or shouldn't buy there. Everyday Aussies engage their services to tap into that intel, so we guide them as to which part of Australia we think they should put some capital in, and then handpick and negotiate the purchase of a property in that location for them.
Yeah. So you're essentially a buyer's advocacy or buyer's agency, but from my observation, you put far more effort and resources into researching than anybody else I know.
That's always been our point of difference. That's a reflection of my personality. Analytical, like joining dots, love understanding and learning the cause and effect of property markets. I will argue till the cows come home that perhaps other than finding a cure for cancer, there is nothing more complicated on this planet than property markets, and that's why I get out of bed each day trying to solve that massive big jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah, so many people are interested in real estate investment, but not very many people know a great deal about it or how to find out what they need to know.
Yeah, well, it's actually not taught anywhere, and a long time ago now, I learnt this by default. A much younger version of Simon Pressley back in the day when I was a sponge trying to learn as much as I could about property markets. I was doing what probably 27 million people are doing today. You're reading lots of material, trying to get good quality intel, but I learnt by default that most of what I was reading contained factually false information. Now, we're talking GFC period when I discovered this, and that made me feel really uneasy, Terry, because it's like, these are big, major financial decisions for my own family's future as well as my client's financial future, and we're making these big decisions largely with factually false information. No one means to mislead the public. But I found that fascinating, and I thought, well, how's that happen? There is actually anywhere in the world that teaches how property markets work. So how are the public ever going to get that intel if there's no profession that does it? Society is guilty of putting the accountant and the economist especially and the bank on the pedestal as the experts. Many of the people who work in that space are clients of mine. Let me tell you, their knowledge of property markets is probably less than the mechanic and the hairdresser. So they mean well, but you don't learn about property markets in any degree. So I made it a mission to learn from the evidence. That first meant buying all the evidence and then spending years and years and years of my life studying the evidence and learning that cause and effect.
Yeah, because all the information anybody could ever need is out there if they know where to go to find it. But the hard part is making sense of it. And that's where we come in as a business and where you come in with what you do.
Absolutely, because what you produce and what we produce isn't passed up on a nice little neat website where everyone can go, and gather all the intel for every one of those 400 locations that I mentioned earlier. It's not all passed up like that. My day is spent, every day is spent gathering intel from 1,000 different sources, and then from every location, and then bringing it together and interpreting it and forming an educated assessment. That's not a hobby. I challenge anyone. You can't do this as a hobby and do it really, really well.
That's right. It's not a. I think far too many people in Australia do treat it as a hobby. It really is. It's a second job if you want to do it well. So you spend a lot of time doing research. You help people buy real estate, but you're also an investor in your own right. And
very much so. Yeah.
I'll talk about that a little bit. Do you remember the first property? How much you paid? Do you still own it?
Yeah, first property, well, geez, show my nearly 54, Terry. So I purchased my first property as a 21-year-old. It was my own home, $91,250. It's funny you remember that sort of stuff, but that's what I paid for it. I was always driven. My father was in the army, so as a child we moved around a heck of a lot, and Mum and Dad never owned a home. And as I was entering the workforce, I realised I got scared for Mum and Dad. How are they going to stop working? They don't own a home, they've got no investment. So that became the driver for what I still do now, right? So I remember feeling very proud as a 21-year-old buying my first home, And my parents, who were 20 years older than me, still hadn't done that. Do I still own it? No, I can't remember. I think I held it for about 10 years. So I moved out of that home. I upgraded to a nicer home 6 or 7 years after, I think. And for a couple of years, I did what a lot of investors did. I kept it. I put a tenant in. I like how people say I converted it to an investment property. I don't like that term, but that's what I did. And then as I started to understand more about investing in property, I realised that's not a great investment and got rid of it. Mm-hmm. What would it be worth now? So in the outer suburb of Brisbane, it was a very modest home and still is standing today, but probably about 600,000.
Yeah. And not many people believe that the first property I ever bought, which was in the early 80s, in the suburb of Bundamba, out near Ipswich, $25,000.
Yeah, unreal.
Yeah, it's extraordinary, isn't it? Probably worth $500,000 or $600,000 today, but yeah.
I did some numbers. You mentioned 25,000. It made me remember some. I did some numbers the other day. So we're now in just early 2024. In exactly 1974, 50 years ago, the combined capital city median house price was $25,000. Today, it's $1,025,000.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
And a lot of people really struggle with that. You know, like it's exceeded the relationship between incomes and the value of property and what you have to pay for property is grown out exponentially. And a lot of people say, oh, that just can't be, but it is. And I think that's one of the topics you spend a lot of time wrestling with, those perceptions in mainstream media about what should be happening in real estate versus what actually does happen and why.
Yeah, I mean, there's 1,000 different, misconceptions about properties, isn't there? One is, and again, I'm going to pick on the economists because they deserve to be picked on, but the statement that property prices have grown at a faster rate than wages. Well, for as long as there's been homes that humans live in, that's always the case, but it's not unique to property. Crunch the numbers and see what the price of fuel has done to the price of wages. Very few things actually keep in step with wages. Now, yes, we need wages to buy property and to pay mortgages, but there's lots of things that affect affordability and whether an individual can personally afford an individual property. And it's not just the purchase price, it's not just the wage they earn, it's the interest rates that are being charged, it's the size of the debt that they've got on that asset, it's how much equity they've got. It's a whole bunch of things that affect one's individual affordability, right? And no two homes are worth the same, whether it's Brisbane, Sydney or wherever. The variation between the most affordable home in a chosen city and the most expensive home, you could be talking $400,000 to $4 million.
Yeah.
And the individuals who live in that city, their salaries might range from unemployment benefits to many millions of dollars.
Yeah. So just going back to you, the private investor, do you have a particular philosophy that underpins what you do as a property investor?
Yes. I mean, if you want to understand property markets, you need to take a keen interest in economics. I don't have an economics background, thankfully, but it is economic growth that has the biggest influence on property price growth, by far more than anything else. But I say the word economics and some people might be thinking, so it's about lowering employment rates. No, there's lots of ways to measure economic growth and unemployment rates are the least effective thing. But it's economic growth at an individual town and city level, not at the stuff that we might read about in the media about the national economy this or the New South Wales economy that. You can't buy the Australian Property Index or the New South Wales Property Index. So we need to understand at a more granular level if you want to get better at anticipating property market outlooks, the leading indicator for that is the economic outlook for that location.
Yeah. So at Hotspotting, we believe that real estate markets are very local in nature and they arise out of the local economy. Clearly, Propertyology, you've got a very similar philosophy.
Yep. Job creation, this is the population theory, right? Again, economists are guilty of so many things. So lots of people think population growth has the biggest influence on property prices. Never has. Never has, right? But because no one studied Australian real estate history, the statement that population growth has the biggest influence on property prices is a logical statement. And a much younger version of Simon Pressley used to believe that too because it's logical, right? But if something's logical, and no one's ever studied the evidence, who's going to hold those people accountable? So this is where the many myths of property markets come from. No one studied the evidence. But economic growth, why that has such a big influence on property markets is before we buy the asset, we buy the liability. We don't like the liability, and we're not wanting to go into debt, but we're focusing on the positive, the asset. So we have to go into debt, but no one goes into debt without having confidence in their ability to pay it back, right? Now, one individual's confidence doesn't influence a property market at all. A big critical mass of people does, their behaviour does. So at an individual town or city level, if you've got a local economy that is improving, as it improves, local confidence will improve and local household incomes will improve. And those two things combined will result in more people transacting in real estate. So there'll be more people moving out of renting a home to becoming a first home buyer. There'll be more people upgrading from an existing owner-occupied property to a nicer property or a bigger property. There'll be less people doing that if they're worried about losing their job, right? So economic growth creates more buyers, and buyers are not a baby being born, which adds to a population figure. Babies don't buy properties, folks. Very few overseas migrants buy properties. The official data confirms that. The biggest critical mass of property transactions every single year, 97% to be specific, are existing residents. So they haven't influenced the population figures at all. But as I said, if they've moved out of rental accommodation to become an owner-occupier, no influence on population figures, but they've created competition in a market. So there's more competition created, more buyer activity when the economy is improving.
Sure. So in terms of the philosophy of property investment, there are some who try to trade their way to wealth. They buy and sell.
Yes.
Whereas we tend to believe that that's not the right way to go. You accumulate good assets and you keep them. You develop a portfolio. What's your philosophy?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can make money in anything, and I'm not going to be the hypocrite who says that property is better than shares or shares are better than property. Just be good at whatever you do, and invest in your future, because if you don't, no one else will do it for you. That's my philosophy. But specific to those who prefer the property asset class over some other asset classes, it's the transaction costs that are the killer as to why trading in real estate. You will never realise your full potential. So the person who might think that they do have a crystal ball and they'll buy at the bottom of a market and they'll pick the top, I mean, good luck with that, right? You and I are the best in the business and we won't do that, right? But there'll be plenty of other people who think that they'll try. So they might think that their strategy might be to sell at the top and to take their capital and put it into another market. Well, that's silly, because when you release that capital by selling that property, you'll pay, depending on the value of the asset, you'll pay $40,000 in agent's commission, and then you'll pay, depending on the purchase price of the property you're buying, you'll pay another, let's call it $50,000 in stamp duty and other associated costs with purchasing that property. You rip up $100,000 of your hard-earned capital from taking it out of one market and putting it into another. So when done well, property is a long-term asset class. Like I'm talking 10, 15 years, depending on how old the individual is. The exception to the rule will be if you've got capital in a market and you got seriously concerned about the outlook for that market. Now that can happen, but Australian real estate has been the most resilient asset on the planet, for more than a century. So it's not very often, whilst it could happen, it's not very often that there's a major downturn without rebounding sometime soon. It can happen, but it's rare.
Okay. So the stats suggest that very few people actually build a portfolio. The ATO figure says 70% of people own just one investment property. Fewer than 1% own 5 or more. Why do you think so few people get to that stage of owning what you might call as a property portfolio?
Yeah, it's a great question. Motivation, purpose, awareness. It's a deep topic, but it's probably the most important topic that anyone can talk about. There's nowhere in society that teaches financial literacy. I'm writing a report on this at the moment. I told you my story. You know, what drove me to invest in property is realising that as hard as my parents worked to earn money, the world doesn't teach anybody what to do with money. So we live in a country that here now in 2024, single biggest expense in the federal budget profit and loss statement is a $50,000 age pension. 1 year. 1 year. 50 billion bucks. Cost about $1 billion per year to build a major hospital. We can't build enough hospitals. Now, that's not a criticism of people on age pensions. That's a criticism of society at large. If we actually taught people more than just giving them the skills to earn money and invest a little bit in their education, teach them what to do with money, and part of that is the consequences if you don't make a few good decisions during the 45 years that you're in the workforce. If we just put a little bit of effort there, that $50 billion per year could progressively reduce. So you're going to have people realising their full potential, people setting goals, achieving dreams. The money we'd save on age pensions can build more hospitals and train stations and all that other essential infrastructure. So that's the top level answer to your question. Why don't people invest in more real estate? But of course, you're referring to some who have already done it, but they just haven't done it enough.
Yeah.
Maybe this, I guess it's different. The answer to that is different for different people, but some people maybe don't have the right strategy in the first place. So they've got the motivation, they've bought a property, but without getting good advice, they might have bought something that is a big drain on cash flow, for example, and so they therefore can't afford to buy the secondary property. Or they might have bought a property, the hometown hero, which is 99.9% of property investors. They confuse knowing their neighbourhood with knowing a market.
Yeah.
Very different things. So almost every property investor buys properties in the town they live in. Foolish. Great for trying and having a go, but the share investor who's got 10 grand with the CBA shares doesn't go and buy more CBA shares because CBA won't always do well. So don't buy in your own location. So that will be the answer to some people. They bought a property, done well, but they haven't been what I believe every investor should be, and that's a borderless investor. Forget where you live, because you're not buying the property as an investor for you to live in. So your personal biases and preferences aren't going to influence the market. Get rid of that stuff and be objective and analyse the 400 locations across Australia. They're the equivalent of the companies on the stock exchange.
Okay. So society doesn't teach people these skills.
Yep.
We don't learn it at school. So people have to educate themselves.
Yeah.
But what we find is that people are actually reluctant to spend money on good advice and good information.
Yeah.
They will get a loan and spend the big amount of money
Yeah.
on a piece of real estate, but they'll balk at spending relatively small sums on getting the advice and information they need to do it well.
Yeah.
That's, I think, part of the problem.
Oh, definitely. There's lots of things in life that we can, adopt the DIY philosophy, or we could also engage someone. But my view is that the more important the decision we're about to make, the more non-negotiable it should become to engage the person who's got the most skills in that space. That's how I run my own life. Obviously, when my profession is as a professional investor, I make my own investment decisions. But in other walks of life, my health, for example, health's important for everybody. I don't be the DIY doctor and jump on Dr. Google and put in some keywords and try and diagnose myself. Like, that would be foolish, right? You go and find the best decision I can make for my health is to get the best medical profession. Now, it doesn't mean that person's can guarantee they've got the right diagnosis or can cure me, but I've given myself the best chance and the best outcome. So financial decisions are just like that. If you want to invest in shares, I think the best decision that you could make is to find the person with the very best skills at reading stock markets. If you want to invest in property, same. If you want to build a house, find the best builder.
So our philosophy and what we preach to people is build your team before you build your portfolio. Important to gather around you expert accountants, buyer's agents, mortgage brokers, quantity surveyors for depreciation, all of those things. Do you agree with that basic concept?
Yeah, I guess it's understanding that there's lots of important decisions within that one key decision of where to buy that property. Now, whether the individual investor, goes and meets face to face with a whole heap of accountants and a whole heap of solicitors and a whole heap of quantity surveyors, although you think of all the property professions, you can do that if you want. That's one way of building a team. And another way of building a team is to identify of all those very important professional services, which service am I going to have the closest relationship with, and that person, if they're really good at what they are, they'll have a team. Now, that doesn't need to be in their office, but they'll have professional relationships with a really good broker and conveyancers and that sort of stuff. And that's probably a better way of doing it, I think, because yes, it's important to have a good team, but a good team is a group of skilled professionals from different backgrounds, but they need to work together. So if Terry was, for example, a younger version of Terry was building his team now, and you went off on your own and handpicked 6 different people from different professions to represent you, that's great. But those 6 people, do they know each other? Will they work together for your common interests? Probably not if they don't have a working relationship together. So what Propertyology does, we don't accept any kickbacks from any third-party service providers, but doing this all day, every day, we get to meet lots of people in different professions, and over a period of time you realise some have more skills than others and some have more ethics than others, and we're proactive in forming relationships with those people, but we don't swap money. It's just like we've got a new client and they need a good accountant, or they need a good conveyancer or a good broker or whatever, and we just join them together.
So how important for an investor starting out is it to get that first one right? Is getting the first one not so right one of the barriers that prevent people from developing a portfolio?
Look, in an ideal world you want to get them all right, but life's not perfect. And the personality types who are perfectionists are often their own worst enemy, because they can never see a perfect situation, so therefore they never make a decision. And that's what's called an opportunity loss, right? So yeah, it's important to get it right, but I think everyone does their best. The consequences of making a decision with that first property that sometime later you realise wasn't the best is you get stagnation. But stagnation can happen after your first property, or second, third, or fourth. The best quality information will give you the best chance of being happy with the outcome. Is probably the best thing to consider there. And the other thing is, no matter what year you are listening to this interview, please know that no matter what's happening in the world, it is always a good time to invest in Australian real estate, because we've got 400 different towns and cities. It's rarely that there'll be a year like 2021 when they're all doing well, but no matter what rubbish is happening, there'll always be lots that it's a good time to invest in them. So as an individual with money, if you can afford to invest in your future today, do so. The key question is where, not when.
Yeah. So the question I'm asked the most is this a good time to buy? And I always say it's the wrong question. The right question is, where is it a good time to buy? You would agree with that?
Spot on. And the answer to that where will be different to Terry and Simon and Peter and Jenny, because their own individual circumstances are different. Yeah. This is one of several reasons why Propertyology buys nationally. Where we recommend one person buys is different to where we recommend the other person buys, because where their current assets are will be different to other people. Again, it's like the share investor philosophy. The share investor has got some CBA stocks and some ANZ stocks and some Woolworths stocks and whatever. They're always looking to put more money into different companies and in different industries on the stock exchange, and Propertyology is doing the same. So someone who's got a portfolio consisting of 2, and they're both somewhere in New South Wales, and they come to us today, we are investing in a couple of New South Wales locations, but we won't be recommending any to that person.
Yeah. Okay. So I think you said you bought your first property when you're 21.
Yeah.
Knowing what you know now,
yeah.
If you could go back in time, what advice would you give to the 21-year-old Simon, if you could?
Yeah, I will. So that was the family home. I bought it on a main road. That's not something I would advise anyone to do. I know why I did it, and I don't regret that I did it, because as I said earlier, the person who procrastinates is an opportunity cost. So the fact that I did it, you gain more knowledge in life through actually doing something than being only retentive and millions of hours spent reading and researching and analysing. So I gained first-hand experience when I went to sell that property. It took longer than something else that was 100 metres away around the corner off the main road, for example. Perhaps a bigger learning experience was my first investment property, which I think I was about age 26. And I'm happy to have a go at myself because I've learned from it. So I bought under the influence of water. Water makes me relax. There's a tranquility about water that relaxes me, but it also makes my brain function exceptionally well when I'm near water. I didn't know that back then. So my first investment property was at Caloundra, and I'm happy to criticise myself. Nothing wrong with Caloundra, by the way. But why did I choose it? Well, I was excited as 2 years after I bought it because I think it grew by about 35% in the first 2 years. So I'm beating my chest, Terry, and I'm saying I've got Colonel Sanders' secret herbs and spices. I knew it. I knew how to pick this hotspot. When all I really did, because in year 3 and year 4, I lost the 35% that I gained in year 1 and year 2. When I made the decision, when I reflected back on why did I pick Caloundra, and it wasn't Colonel Sanders' secret herbs and spices, it's not far from Brisbane where I live, so I really didn't give myself much of a chance of making the best decision possible, because Australia's a bloody big country, right? I bought 100 kilometres up the road. And because I love water, I bought a 2-bedroom apartment smack bang on the esplanade. So I'm beating my chest going, this view can't be built out. Licence to print, this thing will grow forever. I lost the 35% in year 3 and year 4, but the water was still there.
Okay.
So great learning experience.
Yeah.
What I did was not throw the toys out of the cot. In year 4, I made sure that I did everything required to learn why I lost 35% in 2 years.
Okay.
Clearly it was not, the things that I thought were important weren't important. And I realised that I lost 35% because the Sunshine Coast economy in those years performed poorly.
So that's a nice segue to my next question. You were believing perhaps some of the myths and misconceptions that are out there and realised there's a lot of them.
Lots of them.
What are some of the biggest ones that people need to be aware of and avoid making a mistake about?
Yeah, the second biggest one I mentioned earlier is the population growth theory. I mean, the evidence is out there for anyone who really wants to know, and it's been out there for decades. We've published heaps of reports well before COVID to prove to people the difference between an opinion. Everyone's always got an opinion about property markets, but not many people actually can back the opinion up with evidence, right? So we published heaps of reports to prove that population also has some influence, nowhere near as much as what people think. Some people found that interesting, and some didn't want to believe it because it didn't suit them, right? And then COVID comes along, and we had 2 consecutive years there where Australia had its lowest population growth rate in more than a century. But yet we had the biggest property boom. So it was never about population growth. So that's the second biggest myth. The biggest is that capital city and region have anything at all to do with property markets. They never have, and they never will. They're terms. Again, it's like the share investor saying retail stocks versus banking stocks. They're just terms. There can be some dud retail companies and some superb ones. And you can say that with every industry sector. Each of the 8 capital cities are very, very different. You can't compare Hobart to Sydney. They're very different. The economic profile, the size of the population, the weather, they're all very different. 8 out of 8 capital cities are very different, and so are the 400 regions. So region and capital city are just words. Somebody might have spent their whole life living in a big capital city will hear the word region and they'll immediately think risk. It's got nothing to do with it. There are some regions that are very high risk and we would never touch. There are several capital cities I won't invest in either. So it's understanding what is risk, and not many people understand that. They're the 2 biggest, capital city and regions and population growth. There's a lot of emotional considerations because we all live in property. Personal biases, lots of people hang on to their own personal biases. So anyone who thinks that being closer to the water has something to do with properties growing, folks, property is steel, bricks, concrete. It's not an organism. You can stand there with a garden hose all you like, but the bloody thing won't grow. And the water, the beach, has always been there. So inland and coastal have nothing to do with property markets. Some people like living inland and some people live in coastal, but the market doesn't care what an individual likes. Warm climate versus cool climate, they're myths, they're theories. We all like different things, right? But those things that we don't influence markets.
Okay. So a lot of people need to educate themselves. It's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah.
We often say to people, one of the best places you can go to get good information to find out more is with Propertyology.
Thank you.
The excellent research that you do and the infographics that you produce. How do people access that?
Propertyology.com.au. Right at the top ribbon of our website is a little button, subscribe. We don't send any sales material out. We're not salespeople. We're professionals at the end of the day. But I like to think we're extremely generous with the information that we give out freely to the public. But don't think we're ever going to give away our absolute roll gold trade secrets. That's what our clients get. But what we're doing with those who subscribe to our newsletter, which is close to 11,000 people now, I think, is giving away on a regular basis some of our intel, some of our learnings of Australian real estate history to replace the rubbish that ends up in their device every day.
Okay. Simon Pressley of Propertyology, thank you.
Thanks, Terry.